But yeah, so I always like to start this off. I always like to start this off with my name. So I like telling people my name's like Roger, without the Rajong. A lot of people, it's a good reference for people to just kind of listen and understand how to pronounce my name. But here's actually my Hmong name, and it's pronounced Ger Xiong. I don't use it often, but I really only use it when I'm around family or visiting family back in Wisconsin. So actually, when we first arrived in the United States, the immigration office didn't know how to pronounce or write our names, nor did we know how to spell our name within the English language at the time. So our name switched, and my name went to Jer. So I don't know if you can see the difference or not between those two, but that's kind of how my GER came about. Um, and so I find these stories in history really interesting. So especially within the Hmong culture, and um, they have become a really important part of my practice and work. So yeah, so today I'm going to give a little history about the Hmong history, and then get into my work, my influences, and then into my Fulbright research. So if you have any questions, feel free to, I don't know if I can see you all, but feel free to interrupt me throughout this presentation. So I was born in Chiang Kham, Thailand, a refugee camp in 1993. And that same year in December, my family moved to the United States as refugees. So Chiang Kham is on the northern parts of Thailand, within the Powell province in the borders Laos. Me and my four siblings were born in that same refugee camp. So history plays a pretty important aspect within my work. So throughout this presentation, I'll kind of go back and forth within the history of the Hmong context into my work. Um, so with that said, I also want to state now the complexity within the Hmong history. So a lot of what I'm telling you now is just a very minimal part of the history itself. There's still a lot of things that's coming up recently with a lot of the Hmong scholars recently. So um, I'm still planning and hopefully to dig into some of that aspect. So here's a map of Thailand. I think I pointed an arrow out there. That's where Phayao province is, and then Chiang Kham, and the zoom in is what borders Laos. So it's known so far that the Hmong originated from China. A lot of scholars are still figuring out where exactly in China, but the Hmong people used to have their own kingdoms, but after many wars, the kingdom would fall and many Hmong began to migrate to the southern part of China, then slowly into the northern parts of Southeast Asia, such as Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Burma at the time. So throughout history, even today, the Hmong people lives remotely within the mountainous regions of these countries. We're clan orientated, so a lot of the villages consist of certain amount of clans. Our surname defines which clan we are in, so I'm affiliated with the Xiong clan, which is one out of the 18 clans. So photo here there's still a lot of Hmong people living in China. On the picture with the red color, that's where most of the Hmong people are living. And they like to use the term meow, but that term is actually an umbrella term that consists of 4 different ethnic groups, and Hmong being one of them, Koshong, the Mu, and the Amao. And they're all they're different from their language that they speak, and the clothing and the textiles and the jewelry that we wear. And then blue line represents the Mekong River, which is essentially the last obstacle that many family face before getting into the refugee camps into Thailand, from Laos to Thailand. So my mom married into my dad's family in Lao Prabang in Laos, and I think the early 1970s. So by this time, the United States had already left Laos and withdrew from the Vietnam War. So as many people know, the US entered the war around the 60s, but what isn't really told is the secret war that happened during the Vietnam War. The photo of my mom and dad, I think that's actually in 1992, so already our time when we were already in Thailand. So a little history on the Secret War. The US CIA during this time secretly recruited the indigenous people within the land of Laos. And the Hmong people was one of the groups who heavily assisted the US during this time. Because we knew the landscape in the area very well, the US recruited the Hmong people to fight against the communist regime in air and ground operations as pilots, air crews, soldiers, as well as nurses. And this is a photo of the Long Jing, which is a base in Laos where the United States trained Hmong soldiers and nurses. The Hmong helped build the airstrips within that base, and the Hmong soldiers were recruited as young as the age of 13 to 14. And I've heard that if the child was able to hold a rifle or if they were taller than a rifle, they were recruited. This is General Vang Powell, who was a leader that was in charge of the Royal Hmong Lao Army. He agreed with helping the United States and essentially a lot of the Hmong people became part of his army. So during this time, there were also Hmong people who sided and fought alongside the communist regime as well. So that's something that's important to kind of think about. So looking over this whole war, the Hmong people were used as frontline soldiers and people to fight battles that they weren't really part of. And it was either side of the US communist regime or become the collateral damage from the war. So this is General Vang Pao. And then I included a PBS website if you all want to go listen and view the documentary. And it's about the Hmong history and their assistance with the US and the Secret War. It's I highly recommend it. It's very informative about the Hmong veterans from the war and the lifelong fights up until the 2000s. So my father, Li Fengzhang, fought as a lieutenant within the Special Guerrilla Units, SGU, from 1960s, I think, till the late 60s. My dad was first a soldier, and then as fear rose, the war continued. He then moved to La Prabang in Laos and became an educator in Sinqua in Laos. He taught the Lao language in the Lao school, which included Hmong and Lao students. And then here's a photo of my father in his younger year. So yeah, so a couple years later, the U.S. would withdraw from the war, from the Vietnam War, and airlift their highest-ranked Hmong officials and their family out of the war-torn country of Laos, leaving a lot of families who assisted the U.S. during the war behind, breaking the promises of assistance and help after. And here you can see photos of the last evacuation of the Hmong officials. This would be the last time that many families would see the Americans. Families lined up to get on board, but only people who had documents or were high-ranked soldiers were able to get onto this flight. And then the people who did get on the flight became the first waves of refugees into the US, which is around in mid or late 70s. My family would be the ones who were left behind, fighting off the genocide and persecution of the Hmong people. So as the persecution and the genocide arose, many families fled Laos into Thailand, where there were refugee camps. And then many families also fled, hid in the jungles. Others were captured, taken into re-education camps, which essentially was death. And anyone who assisted the US during the Vietnam War were to be captured and, in quotation mark, re-educated. So the pictures that I'm gonna be showing are photos after our travels into the Chinkan refugee camp. So this is my siblings, my nieces and nephews, 91 to 92, around that time. So yeah, so because of fear, a lot of family left Laos right after the US took off. And my family would leave Laos, I think around mid 80s to get to Thailand for the refugee camps because of my father's assistance with the war. And this is a picture of my mom, her kids, my dad, and then my other siblings, youngest to oldest. So my family leaves Laos in '84 by truck, and we're dropped off by the Mekong River, which divides the Laos and Thailand border. So my family paid a Laotian person to take us across a boat, which included my mom, my dad, 3 other sisters, and a few other relatives. So about 20 total people, and we arrived in Thailand, and then we're placed into the Chin refugee camp, and the rest of my siblings would then be born. So more photos of refugee camp. And then I was born in May of 1993 and December of, and then in December 1993, my family would move to the United States as refugees and resided in Wisconsin and joined the rest of my family members who left before us. So my family would be considered the third wave of refugees from these camps that arrived in the U.S. around the early 90s, which would be essentially be the last wave of refugees. But you will get more in the 2000s because in the 90s they closed down all the camps. But Chin was one of the few that they allowed people to stay in. So these waves are primarily for the United States and other countries too, but this started the Hmong diaspora throughout the world. So families are placed in countries such as Germany, Australia, Canada, France, French Guiana, and the US as being the most taken in refugees, as well as Argentina. So because we were client-oriented, a lot of families traveled to the place where their family were placed in, or others would be sponsored through churches or families who were able to sponsor other family members. So as an overview of the diaspora of the Hmong people. So I was less than a year old before coming to the US. We resided in Appleton and continue to reside in Appleton up until this day. Actually, well, we moved to Kimberly and then came back to Appleton, but my teenage years was spent in Kimberly, Wisconsin, which is right next to Appleton. So growing up, I grew up in a pretty predominant white community in school, so very minimal diversity within the schools of Kimberly, Wisconsin. I began to divert my attention away from the Hmong community and cultures and slowly assimilated myself into the American culture. I studied English and and I became pretty proficient in English as my Hmong language slowly declined. So here's some photos of our first few years in the U.S. My siblings, my mom, and then this picture is from I think a Hmong woman who would come and tutor me, I think once a week, and read to me. So by that time, I got to UW-Whitewater, and then I began to explore my Hmong identity and became interested in all this history that I just talked about at the beginning of this presentation and discovering where my family is from. So I was interested in the story of the Hmong migration from Thailand to the United States, using symbols, patterns, and narratives that were used within the Hmong craft, such as the tapestries. Um, I was also very curious about the Hmong religious objects and why they were used within the Hmong culture. So this is on the bottom left corner here, you can see the split horns that are used within the Hmong rituals and ceremonies, along with other objects that are used within the rituals. So by the time I got, so this is a piece that represents the split horn that was shown in the previous slide. And this was made in my Intro to Metals class in the book project, I believe. This was really the first time that I began to think about the narratives of our history and using that as a way to show our migration to the United States. So a lot of these narratives came from narratives from the Hmong tapestries, and I was interested in putting them onto this religious object. And then how these horns would work is they would throw these horns at the front of the person's home to call a person's spirit back. And whichever way the horn lands, up or down, side by side, different angles would tell the shaman different things or different outcomes of the person's spirit. And then I became very interested in the forms of Hmong jewelry and the representation, their symbolism and significance to our culture. It's a form of documentation pretty much of our history and time. And historically what these objects are for ornamentation, documentation. So I wanted these pieces to show our history at the same time, finding ways to connect back to my own culture history and putting myself into the same position of a Hmong maker as well. And this really became the best way for me to find a connection back to my family members, my history through these objects to tell my own experience in our histories. Oops. Sorry, and then just a little bit more about material. So silver is within the culture shows a person's wealth as well as a material to protect one's spirit. So we believe that in animate and inanimate object, there lies a spirit or spirits. Everything, everyone has their own set of spirits. So jewelry and objects are used to protect the wearer or the place that it's in or the place that it's in from these wandering spirits and possibly evil spirits. So a good example right now is right when I got to the U.S., my mom handed me this pin for me to wear. So my mom's been telling me to wear it throughout my time here to protect from the virus and everything that's happening. So I find these objects really interesting and on why we're wearing them or why we continue to wear them. So growing up unknown to Hmong culture and history, I began my exploration of Hmong jewelry and body adornment. I explored my family's history, cultural heritage, before, during, and after assistance with the US in the war. So each piece resembles a time during my family's migration to the United States, as well as using Hmong culture as an influence and inspiration, such as traditional Hmong jewelry, the symbols, patterns, and colors. So this piece represents the Mekong River that many families had to cross in order to get to the safe haven, the refugee camps. And on there are little boats that are hanging from the piece, as well as patterns up in the necklace part that represents the many patterns that are on the Hmong textile as well. This necklace resembles different aspects of my father that are etched onto circular coin shapes. And I wanted the shape to resemble coins, which is a reference to the French Indochina coins that are attached to the Hmong clothing and jewelry. Through stories and photos I've seen of my father, these different aspects includes my father being able to speak multiple languages, his place of death, how he was killed, and the idea of me being his reincarnation because I was born right after his death. I think most of these were during for my junior review, I believe, 2015. So crossing the Mekong River has been a huge part of many Hmong families around the world. It was a river of hope, but also fear that they may no longer come back to a country that they've called home for so many years. Fear of leaving their family behind, fear of death while crossing the river, but also hope that they will reach the safe haven of the refugee camps. So the snake here, the snake has a really strong affinity and powerful symbol within the cultures. It acts as a symbol of spiritual and physical protection from evil spirits. So here represents a snake as a form of protection that hangs from the piece are 3 different rings that are cast in silver to represent each part of a transition or migration from one place to another. The rings can be removed, worn, and then put back. Separation became a very big part of the war. So many families had to leave their families behind. My father left his mom behind back in Laos. A lot of families were divided into smaller groups for trekking. So they weren't heard of, or so they weren't as loud through the forests in the hopes that they would reunite back in the camps in Thailand. But up to this day, there's so many families that are still searching for their loved ones and family members from the separation. So this piece was first fabricated as one, then pierced and divided where the lengths would connect yet separate the 2 pieces. And etched onto these pieces are the migration that comes from the Hmong tapestries, which I'll show a little bit later on. This piece represents the flotation devices that many families used or made in order to cross the Mekong River. Many families created rafts out of bamboo stalks for families or stuck them under their arms to float across. Many blew up plastic bags in order to help them float across this river. So this brooch is based off on those stories where the bags up here are raised from copper sheets and connected to the bamboo stalk forms on top. And the chain links represents the top view of the boats. So here's a good chart on what these patterns means and their significance. Patterns are influenced by the Hmong lifestyles, agriculture, and spiritual connections to the spiritual world and after. So what's important here is that the Hmong language is an oral language and didn't get a written language or official language until until around the 50s. But many scholars argue that we have had our own language throughout history, but being forced to assimilate into the Chinese culture, anyone who spoke the language or wore the traditional clothing were killed. So a lot of this was lost through warfare and assimilation. Um, so the women were known and started to stitch and create these patterns to preserve the language and culture, as well as to communicate to families from afar. And many scholars and people also states that the women were known to stitch the language between the fold and skirts of clothing. Being home has been good because I've been able to document some of my mom's textile work. So I'm going to show a little bit of her work. She made this while she was in Laos, and then she's carried it with her up until this day. And these are to wrap around the waist and the back. My mom made this in the refugee camp in Thailand. And then, so like I said, a lot of their afterlife is very important to the culture. So this piece was hand stitched and shipped to my mom from her sister in Laos. And it's soon to become a pillow, which would then be buried with the individual who would then, when they pass, this object will follow with them to the afterlife. So objects are given to people when they reach a certain age in preparation for the afterlife. So these objects would go and follow them to their afterlife to help assist them to reach their place of birth, then they can go or be reincarnated into the next world. So during the afterlife, when the person passed, they would travel back to all the places that they moved to or they lived in, and these objects or anything that were buried with the person would help assist the individual through their afterlife. So these objects are very an important part within the culture. So looking into my senior thesis work, my work looked at connections between me, my father, my family through the use of my own culture as an influence. So what really began to start this work was my longing and yearning for my father, as well as loss and grieving. So my father actually passed away, like I said, a month before I was born in Chinkam. The reasons why we and many families fled was the fear of being captured and persecuted. So this is our shop that we had back in Chinkam. We sold snacks, drinks, small household items for anyone. Um, and then, so the story is my father decided to sleep overnight one night, woke up to the sound of knocking on the front door and opened the door and was shot right by the front door, point blank. What's really interesting to me is figuring out why he was killed other than his assistance with the United States during the war. Because this was in a refugee camp, a lot of Laotian soldiers were not able to get into the camps. So up until this day, a lot of my family are still wondering who killed him. And also when someone passes in their afterlife, in order to be reincarnated, they have to go through all these, their migration. So a lot of my family assumed that my father is lost through his afterlife journey because of him trying to figure out who murdered him back in the refugee camp. So around Thanksgiving of 2015, I found two cassette tapes of my father's audio recording of him telling his folk tales in Hmong. This was my first time hearing about these objects and my first time essentially listening to my father's voices. And this sparked up essentially what my senior thesis is about. I want to share these photos because we've all shared the same space. So this is, I took up most of the space in the studio during the last week of the thesis show. Let's see. So yeah, so my thesis became about the loss of my father and the yearning for an individual who I had never met, as well as my family relationships through the use of Hmong patterns, colors, symbols, and forms. In this piece, I wanted to make a piece that holds the cassette tape that is made of precious material as well as protective material. So through connections, I was very interested in chain links and how it connects one piece from one another and the different ways of connections and links. So I focus a lot of this on chain making, pattern making through tracing, repoussé, stamping, as well as other forms and processes used in traditional Hmong silversmithing and metalsmithing, such as forging and forming. So this piece, one side holds a jade, and then the other side does not hold one, which looks at the absence of my father within our relationship. With more connections and interest in the use of spirals, which is a really prominent symbol within the Hmong textiles. I wanted to introduce this more into my work through these wires and these forms. So I was also interested in using two materials. So here, using the brass and copper resemblance of me and my father, and them essentially coming back into essentially meeting up and coming together on the bottom where the brass and copper are intertwined and linking the two material together. So yeah, some more chain links as a metaphor of connecting one piece to another. Here was a whole chasing rebusé piece, then cut in half, and the other half was cut into 13 other small pieces, resembling the number of siblings that I have, and the need and yearning for the knowledge and father to create and start having these conversations to better understand one another and him. So with separation distance, this piece looks at the heaviness of loss, which is the heaviest of all the other pieces. It includes two sterling silver jump rings that are lost within the other links, which are distant from one another. The connection becomes paths and ways for these two silver jump rings to connect. This is a continuous piece. I was interested in the years that we've been in the U.S. So 1993 was a big year for me. It was when I was born, my father's death, and our move to the United States. So here, each link looks at the amount of years that we have been in the U.S. So 1 link, 2 link, 3 link, and goes up to 26 links, or 24 links at this time. But I'm still working on it up to this day. So every year in May, I would add the amount of years that we've been in the U.S. So it'll be 27 in May. 13 hinges. So here includes 13 hinges to connect the pieces together, which is the number of my siblings, and looks at finding the right ways to connect these two pieces through the brass keys on the right side of this piece. And then wanted to share this photo. It's an altar that is within each of a Hmong person's home, where the shaman would come and perform the rituals in front of their altar, which connects the family's life and the spiritual world. And you kind of see all the different objects that are on this altar, and that's what inspired this piece, is creating a vessel form that holds holds materials such as rice and other burning sticks in this altar. And then these 3 paintings became part of my thesis show. So this looks at my relationship with my father through my jewelry. So with no other forms of being able to connect, I painted portraits of him wearing my jewelry that I made to like our relationship, more to connect us through the jewelry that I make. And this essentially was my thesis show at UW-Whitewater. Quick shot of it. And a fun thesis photo about and Alec Way, the tall guy in the back, was also a graduate student during the same year. So we shared the same space this time. So after graduating Whitewater in the spring of 2017, I went straight into graduate school the following fall semester of 2017 at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I packed up my belongings and drove down to the Southwest. So I began to explore more textile work and how that can become an influence into my work as it relates to the aesthetic and history of the Hmong textiles. I began to explore materials that are relevant to the American culture. I began to be curious about my cultural identity as Hmong American, how to connect both identity and cultures by using materials that are relevant to the American culture and through my own experience. McDonald's, as I worked there for almost 10 years, and the consumption of alcoholic beverages such as Bud Light, which is a very big drink within the Hmong community. So these are the Hmong tapestries that I've been talking about. These tapestries told many Hmong stories, their lifestyles, show their clothing, especially the migration after the Vietnam War, depicting themselves running away from soldiers, shooting them, and to them crossing the river to reach the refugee camps. So a lot of this is also documenting their lifestyles back in the mountainous regions of Southeast Asia, preserving this history. And these tapestries didn't, started actually in the refugee camps to preserve our history for others to know what happened during the war. And up until now, a lot of the textiles were very symbolic. So a lot of them included symbols. So this was the first time that we started seeing narrative and figurative work within the Hmong textiles. So I began exploring more techniques with Hmong craft, embroidery, sewing, and stitching. So through looking at Hmong textiles and tapestries, I wanted to explore the contemporary lifestyles of being in an American setting, the Midwestern factory building, fast food, restaurants, their American, in quote, white picket fence. The shift identity became important as language became an important part of my time, unless crucis. As my time unless crucis increased, my Hmong decreased even more. So this piece documents my conversation with my mom and the different ways of trying to figure out how to use a word that we don't have in Hmong to describe to describe it in find a word in English to describe it in Hmong. So the Hmong is a descriptive language. So there's words that we don't have because we never really they weren't objects that we had back in our life in the mountains. So describing Facebook to my mom, I just used Facebook because I didn't really know what else to use. So on one side, it's in Hmong language, and then the other side, it's in English text. And along with this was an audio that was playing in the background. And then going back to ideas of family and their influences on my cultural identity, I sent out a message to family members asking for their clothing and a note on why they chose that clothing. And I connected all these different fabrics and clothing to one another to create the connections between us. So I began to explore various materials and other techniques, such as acrylic, styrofoam, processes of laser cutting, sewing machine. I became very interested in the use of line very early in my year of graduate school. Using line as a metaphor of navigation, moving from one place to another. And also, like, I was also very interested in the process of switching and turning a piece. So using having jewelry as a way to switch pieces and having a reversible on both sides, being able to wear on both sides. So the more I worked with the materials, the more I began to think about the waste and collection of what I was not using. So culturally, we kept everything that we would throw away. So no food would go to waste. No food would go to waste. So I thought about this process of collecting strings of my own T-shirt and encapsulating it into a necklace piece. And I was also interested in my Hmong American identity and the different ways to depict both, or how they can be both shown in a piece through sports or games. So I looked at the American sport of baseball, as well as the forms of Hmong balls for the ball tossing court game that will happen at the New Year's celebration, which I will show later on. So the more I talked about my identity, the more I realized that it wasn't just about bridging both cultures, but living in between cultures. The constant change of going from one place to another, the negotiation of my identity. So I questioned myself, how do I live in these different cultures without losing my Hmong heritage? And when I navigate between these cultures, how do I keep my Hmong identity as well as this American aspect of my identity of growing up in the US? So I began to use techniques that affiliated with one culture. Sewing machine equals fast production, which I relate to American hand stitch equals Hmong, and using colors that are associated with each culture, red, white, and blue, American fluorescents, which are used in the Hmong textiles. And then I started beginning exploring other disciplines in the forms of helping to better convey my ideas. So there are some pieces that I did some performance and video work. This is a photo of a video of me painting strips of colors that represents the Hmong culture. And throughout the video, it's me whitening it out and repainting the line over and over again, which looks at the constant change of migration and adapting from the erasure and loss of the Hmong culture. So going back to the amount of years that we have been in the US, this line is repainted 25 times. So Hmong clothing is always interesting to me. Being tribe orientated, each tribe has different kinds of colors, forms, clothing, headdresses, patterns, and the processes of making. So my family is in the white tribe, so our clothing would be different from other tribes, such as depicted here. So the black tribe is on the left, and then the flower tribe is on the right. So here's some example of the Hmong clothing from male and female. You can kind of see the difference between the other tribe as well. And also, the more I look into clothing, it's not just this, but also clothing differs in which country you're in. So Hmong Thai has different clothing styles compared to Hmong Lao, which is also the same as neckwear and its form and its headdresses. So because of that, I was interested in my own clothing and textiles and my American clothing that I've had throughout my whole life or throughout my whole time. So I began to stitch onto all my American shirts with Hmong patterns, colors, symbols, sometimes adding onto the clothing, sometimes removing American patterns, such as removing the stitching of the American eagle and adding onto a Hmong symbol or pattern and placement of that symbol. And here are some examples of what I stitched onto my clothes, my shirts, the patterns, sometimes narratives, sometimes just patterns, and different forms or different materials such as beads, American coins, pennies, nickels. So as you can see, some ideas began to resurface, such as the cassette tapes that I became interested in the stories that my father was telling through these cassette tapes. So I wanted to dive into what the stories were actually really about and really listening to the folk tales that are told throughout these cassette tapes. And also these cassette tapes has a very big history within the culture as well as when we were living in the US, my mom would record these cassette tapes and then ship them abroad to family members in Laos. And then this process would continue on and on and on until Facebook. So throughout this process, I listened to his folktales and began to sew and draw with the sewing machine, depicting my translation, what I thought the story was. The outside became the story, the narrative work, machine sewn, as the inside became the dialogue and writings of what the story is, hand stitched. And here's an installation shot of 6 cassette tapes pieces where the viewers can look at the narratives and listen to the folk tales my father tells from the cassette tape player. So more recently, I began to become more and more fascinated with these stories, trying to depict and tell my own stories through these narratives. Using similar patterns of Hmong tapestries and textiles, I'm creating these through my own experience, through the change of culture, place, space, and environment. And I wanted to push more about the boundaries of both sides of a piece that may resemble both sides of my own cultural identity, the changing of front and back, what is the front, what is the back, the action of changing between identity within different environments. So these stories depict more of Hmong American environment, the change of these environments and the shift between village to the city. And then I became fascinated with other forms of normance and consumerism through American fast food chains. The Starbucks series started as a way to look at the consumerism within American culture, the disposability of cultural loss, as well as a form of education. And on these sleeves, I stamped them all with an Instagram account that I would then fabricate to become a tool of educating the people through Instagram about the Hmong people and their history from these objects. So I was interested in the use and disposability of these. I questioned how will people stop to look at a sleeve that is protecting their hands from the heat, or would they simply throw it away without notice or acknowledgement? And where would these sleeves end up as they migrate with the person who is drinking the hot beverage to another place? I gave this proposal to Starbucks on campus to randomly give to customers, but they unfortunately didn't allow it. So I would simply place them in the cup holders or any sort of holders that they had sitting out. And only the people who had access to the Instagram account would be able to access the account. So I was interested in what people thought when they saw the cups and hoped that people would get back to me on these stories. And I made my first post on using some hashtags so that I can follow and track where these cups and these sleeves are going. So these tapestries can get very big, and a lot of them, some tell stories from China all the way up to the US. And I was very interested in creating my own visual narrative and figurative work based on these tapestries. So I started to look at how I can keep the traditions of the Hmong tapestries and narratives and explore more into how our lifestyles are now in the US, our locations, the changes that happens, and our continuous adaptation to our environment and resilience. So I used a tapestry that I found and expanded on the piece, creating different ways that represents the US, such as the suburban homes, highways throughout the city, cityscapes, the fast food restaurants that continuously comes up in my work. And this piece can be interchangeable, taken on and off, switch to one grid to another, changing the stories around. Each grid can be taken off and be worn as a brooch, but as it is taken off, the tapestry begins to lose its story. As more and more gets lost, the story begins to lose its history too, but the story migrates with the person who is wearing the story for others to see. But when being put back on may create new stories or imageries, or the misplacement of the pin looks at the displacement of the Hmong people and the culture throughout time. But essentially, it slowly comes back together, but maybe in a different way or form, or the same story, finally being able to attach and create it as one again. So that was up until the end of my second year. So now I'm going to talk about my fellowship, my Fulbright fellowship a little bit. So I was very fortunate to be accepted into the Fulbright Fellowship, where I proposed to go back to Thailand to research the Hmong craft as textiles, clothing, and jewelry. My proposal was to research and document and also collaborate with these artisans within Thailand, and eventually creating exhibitions or shows during my time there and after my time there. And this was a research to also help my MFA thesis work. This is my mom and I before I left in Chicago. And this is Dr. Prasit Lee Precha. He acted as my advisor. He's a professor at the Faculty of Social Science at Chiang Mai University. He is Hmong, and he has a very big, vast knowledge of the Hmong history and the people within Thailand. So I was very fortunate that he accepted, or he I was very fortunate to have him as an advisor, because he helped me on where the Hmong villages are and helped me throughout my time in Thailand. And I'm going to talk just a little bit briefly about my Fulbright experience. There's still a lot of things that I'm still trying to process and trying to connect all these stories together. So I'm just going to really scratch the surface of what my this research was about. But there was a lot of things that I did learn from this experience. I met the people who worked at the commission office, the Fulbright Commission Office in Bangkok, who assisted my funding and my transition to Thailand and then back to the United States. So big thank you to them. They were very, very helpful during my time there. So here's a map of Thailand and my ventures during my time in Thailand. So I started this in October of 2019. So all these arrows are provinces which have Hmong villages within them. Um, these were the places that I was able to see and be a part of during my time there. And the Hmong villages are mostly in the northern region of Thailand, which starts from Phetchabun province and then up. So anything up there is considered the northern part of Thailand. And Phetchabun is the last one down there, the lowest. So this is Jaya. He's actually a PhD student at Chiang Mai University. They call it CMU. Dr. Prasid connected me to him, and he showed me around in Chiang Mai. So I want to give I want to give a big thank to him because he assisted during my whole time while I was in Thailand, and he introduced me to many of the Hmong students at Chiang Mai University, showed me to many various Hmong villages around Chiang Mai and other places, and he's very well versed in the Hmong history, specifically the Hmong history in Thailand. So he gave me a lot of good information, and we had a lot of good conversations about the Hmong history. Here are some Hmong students that I was able to meet. I spent most of the first month or two really getting to know these students and their history. And it was exciting to meet some other Hmong students who were in the faculty of fine arts at Chiang Mai University. So I was able to talk to them about Hmong art, history, and the perspectives on Hmong art and what they're making. This guy next to me down here, he's actually from Australia, and he was doing his PhD on I think Hmong craft as well. So he was in Thailand um, studying the refugee camps in Thailand. So it was great going around the villages and meeting the students as well as helping them within these villages. Also great being able to celebrate with the home graduating students at Chiang Mai University. Being able to see their success in education was very eye-opening, and seeing how these students do within the school was amazing too. A lot of these students are very fortunate to be able to um, be at the university level. A lot of families in the Hmong villages would usually only send one person of their family member to an education because they can only afford one person. So they would choose only one person out of their family. And so education plays a very important part within Thailand here. There's a little celebration with Dr. Prasid and the Chiang Mai University Hmong Club. So one of the biggest things up until now, many of the research that I found focuses on the Hmong American experience in history. And what I soon found out was the Hmong Thai experience, their history with the Vietnam War when it was going on, their fight during the Cold War, their relationship with the Thai nation state. So many of the things that I've learned was that there was Hmong people already living in Thailand during the insurgence of the Vietnam War. So some of the families here didn't have as many connections to the war as compared to the Hmong in the US, where we can trace and see that the family members in the US are all mostly from the Laos. So it's interesting to trace their own history of where they were coming from, as some came from Cambodia, some came from Myanmar when they were migrating from China to Southeast Asia. And these are photos of Hmong villages up in the mountains of Chiang Mai. You can kind of see the pockets of where all these Hmong people are living within these places. So during my time here, I was able to experience the Hmong New Year in Thailand, which is a very big part of my time here. It's an event where many families would take off work and come together to celebrate the end of the harvest season and their successful harvest, as well as preparing for the upcoming New Year. Oops. So this is in Apaklang, non-province in Thailand. So for the textiles, at the beginning of each year, family members would begin stitching a clothing for their kids or for themselves for the upcoming new year. So these clothing are never really worn twice, and each year would come a different kind of different clothing style, color, or patterns. And for the new year, I was able to travel to Nan province, Da province, and then back to Chiang Mai for the New Year celebration, which was from the last week of December up until the first week of January. So what's so interesting about the Hmong clothing is that with the diaspora, the Hmong people throughout the world, a lot of the Hmong people are wearing each other's tribal clothing. So the Hmong whites are now wearing Hmong green clothing and vice versa. Hmong green are now wearing Hmong striped clothing. So a lot of these clothing are getting mixed and matched um, for people to wear. Another interesting thing about the Hmong clothing and jewelry is that each country where the Hmong lives has their own set of style for clothing. And this also dates very far back. So each tribe in each country will have their own style of clothing. Hmong white in Thailand will wear different clothing than the Hmong white in Laos. And essentially, you can start to really look at the migration through these clothing and these textiles as they move from Laos to Thailand to the United States. So, like I was talking ball tossing before, it's a big part of the New Year celebration. Many young people will come in hopes of finding a partner. Hence, they would wear their best outfit and they would come and ball toss, find a partner to ball toss with, and they would throw the ball across towards one another. And traditionally, if someone drops the ball, they would have to sing a song to the other individual. That's kind of how they would communicate and you would say flirt in a way. uh, So a lot of this doesn't really happen in the U.S. anymore. Ball tossing isn't as prominent in the U.S. anymore. But here, as you can see, a lot of people are still ball tossing. Um, there, you can find men and women just standing around waiting to be asked to ball tossed with. So a lot of people come here to prepare to be asked and to find a partner. And a lot of this is outdoor. All the celebrations outdoor, but in the U.S. it's indoor because we celebrate ours during November, especially in Wisconsin. It's already cold by then, so it's now changed to the indoor places of like schools or homes. So you can start to see the changes of the Hmong clothing. I was very interested in his clothing because you start seeing pockets that's being added onto these clothing for our phones. So I wanted to take pictures of what was different from this compared to the other traditional Hmong textiles. You can see here the stars here are very stars on the sleeves, and the pants are very prominent to the northern region of Thailand. I haven't really seen any other of the people, the Hmong who lived in Phetchabun, closer to Bangkok, wear these patches, and also the Hmong Lao don't wear any of these patches actually. If they do wear it, usually the clothing is bought from Thailand and then sold in Laos. So I always get asked, do the men here wear jewelry and clothing? And I would say yes. So we wear the jewelry, we wear the textiles, we wear all of it. A few landscape shots of the Hmong New Year that I was able to attend. So what's really interesting about the Hmong villages here is that it's very clan orientated. So each village are clustered of the clans in one place. So the Hmong Xiong will live right next to their Xiong clan, and the same as the Li clan within a village. But in the US, so students are always asking me if it's the same here, but we do live in the same city, but just not neighbors. We do follow our clans, but we just don't live right next door to one another. And clan affiliation is very important here. So when I got there, when I would introduce myself as a Hmong Xiong, they would tell, "Oh, I'm a Zhang too." So we were like high five or like shake hands. Like there's affiliation that we have with one another, even though we never met one another. Here's some jewelry pieces that was being sold at the vendors at Chiang Mai Hmong Year. So I began to be really interested in the Hmong diaspora and the Hmong migration, which has changed the Hmong history and the perspective. Um, and I'm also interested in how the Hmong are navigating the Hmong identity through living in different countries, such as what are the similarities and differences between me, a Hmong American, to a Hmong Thai person, or a Hmong living in Australia, France, Canada, or Germany. And this diaspora has also changed a lot of the craft as well. So when I got here, a lot of some of these pieces, there's trade routes that are happening from Thailand to Laos to Vietnam. So you will get the Hmong people who are living in Thailand trading clothing with the Hmong people in Laos, and they will sell one another's clothing which within their country. So here you will see a lot of Vietnamese Hmong clothing, as well as Hmong Lao clothing as well. And then I really looked at how consumerism really changed the Hmong craft and how it looks in its concepts. So tourism and the consumerism really affected and changed the craft. And it's a huge industry within the world and in Thailand and these areas right now. So usually, historically, the Hmong craft was usually only consumed by the local people, the villages within um, the Hmong villages. But as it entered the global economy, the forms and textiles began to shift and change to the consumers and their needs and wants. This is Lee. She's a Hmong merchant, and she makes everything that's in her shop and store. And I was able to get her perspective on how she makes her work and her processes in Chiang Mai. And she lives in Payao, so all right. So consumer objects began to rise. Hmong blankets, coasters, tote bags, eyeglass case, coin bags, backpacks are all very recent objects. Consumers wanted utilitarian objects, objects that they can put to use instead of something that just hangs on the wall. So the makers began to create objects that brought more consumers in by these objects. Let's see. So during when the Hmong were in the refugee camps, there were organizations that assisted the Hmong in order to get income while they were living in the refugee camps. My mom learned at a very young age how to stitch, and she started stitching and while we were in Chincom to get income for our family. And also, Sabandao and these textiles, these craft objects became a very important part of the Hmong income. And a lot of tourists, a lot of NGOs, a lot of soldiers will buy these crafts and ship them abroad to families. And this cycle will then start the changes of these craft into these everyday objects. In the tourist industry in Thailand is huge. You can find these objects everywhere, but just something that I would kind of get into later on into this research of who can sell these craft. Yeah. So let's see. So during the time in refugee camps and a little bit after, NGOs are beginning to see what was selling, what wasn't selling, so the craft would change to the taste of consumers. If colors were too bright, the colors would become more muted. If the symbols were too big, it would become more unified. If the object was too small, it would become bigger. If it wasn't a utilitarian object, it would become a tote bag. If the color combination didn't match, there was a catalog where people would be able to choose the color combination of their choice for the artisan to make and create. So also during this process, to keep up with the consumers, a lot of people are now using sewing machines instead of hand sewing these pieces. So into some jewelry work, mass production of the jewelry also expanded as well. Materials changed to silver-plated brass for jewelry, lost wax casting. There's still a few silversmiths, which I met, and I'll talk a little bit about them a little bit. But this was in Paklang, Nan province. Many are stamped on brass and silver plated. Many of these objects are sold as single object. Others are sold as already made object. These can be shipped in different ways. It can be shipped separately to the person who's ordering it. Then they would attach these pieces together to create their own style of jewelry, or they would be shipped already ready to be sold. I was very fortunate to be able to go look at his studio space and his business here. So this piece he is holding is an aluminum Hmong necklace, which is from Laos. He says that they used to not have any sort of metal to use for jewelry, so they will find discarded aluminum and other metal to create the jewelry. So I find that very interesting of how important jewelry was during our time throughout migration, especially during warfare as well. It's amazing to see his knowledge about how these equipments work. He says he ordered, I forgot where, I have to go back and look at my um, interviews, but these were shipped from Europe. So it's amazing to see how he's able to work with these equipments that he possibly may have not even known how to read some of the directions on there. More of his casting room space and equipment. Jay was really interested and intrigued on this process, so he was asking me all sorts of questions while we were in there. So this would be the inside of the studio space where they would connect the pieces together. So silversmiths would use to melt down the silver coins when they used to be silver to create jewelry. So here are some rupees, which during this time is sterling silver, as they say, so you can melt and use them for silver. But now they really just used purchase the silver grains and use those. This was merely for people to see where they used to get their silver. And coins itself has a very big history with the Hmong culture from the French colonization and Indochina then. This is Sai Lu Tao. He's a silversmith in Ban Tang Loa in Chiang Mai. I was able to work with him for a couple of days. He's self-taught and started creating jewelry because he wanted a piece of jewelry for himself and his family. So he picked up some tools and learned the process by himself. And a lot of these stamping tools are also all handmade. He made all of his hammers from materials that he found. He built his whole studio space here, which is a pretty cool, great space. This is Sai Li Tao with his wife. And a little bit off the screen would be their home in that area, and they would also sell textile work there as well. So I also went to Ban Mae Mai in Chiang Mai province. I worked with Sami Ya for 7 days, supposedly 2 weeks, but I had to come back. So I was fortunate to have the 1 week there with him. And he started off as a self-taught, then would then become an educator and teacher and worked for the Thai royal family and taught many other silversmiths in the royal family. So he started the same as Sailu. He wanted jewelry for himself. So he picked up some tools and started with aluminum, nickel, and then slowly into silversmithing. So some more of his tools, which lays over a batik cloth. And we pulled our own wire here, so there wasn't real or anything. So we had to literally melt our own ingots and then hammer them. Thankfully, he had a roller press, so we were able to get as thin as we can and then pull it to the gauge that we needed. So we used like 24 to 26 gauge, so it was a lot of like hours of pulling wire. But it was very interesting in going through the process of just pulling your own wire instead of giving a ship. So we ended up making a few pieces together. He would start a piece off, and then I would then use this piece as a reference as a starting point. So this was the first piece that we made together. And then we eventually would make necklaces and other chain making bracelets as well. It's really amazing working up here. Sami would always sit and make and then go and sit and sip on his tea, look at towards the mountains, and then come back and help with my work. So it's amazing working in the mountains. The space is so amazing. So the Hmong diaspora has been a big part of the Hmong history. This picture is on top of Sami's house. There are Hmong people now living all around the world, living in different nation states. So many different experiences and stories from all the Hmong people in the migration story. Unfortunately, I had to come back early, so I came back at the end of March. But essentially, this research really and I hope to lead up to being able to go into the rest of the diaspora of Hmong countries and researching their history and learning how their crafts are evolving in their nation state. So immersing myself and coming back to the place that I was born was actually very eye-opening and very life-changing for me. Throughout my experience, I've always wanted to reconnect and made it my goal to come back here to learn, research, understand, and connect with my people here. And being here has done just that. So I made a lot of friends, and I met a lot of artists too during my time here. And a lot of being able to meet them has been very amazing because they've offered to take me when I come back to live in their villages and show me more about the land, their history, and teach more of their knowledge. So a big thank you to all the people that I met in Thailand. Unfortunately, wasn't able to say I wasn't able to say bye to any of these people that I met, which is very heartbreaking because they gave me a lot of information, and I really wanted to thank them for their time. But I would like to thank them here, and it was great learning from their perspective, their histories, how students were able to afford the college education, where their families came from, showing me their villages and letting me stay in their homes, the generosity, taking their time to talk to me. Um, there's a saying in the Hmong culture that when you're Hmong and we live in different places, whenever you go to a Hmong place or a Hmong home, they're always going to be welcoming because we're all one people. We all come from the same place. So that's definitely what I got here. And that's definitely what I received from the Hmong community in Thailand. Everybody offered places for me to stay, places and people for me to talk to. So that was very welcoming. And being here for sure has just slowed me down to think about our lifestyles in the US and how fortunate I was able to receive this fellowship as well as what we take for granted at times, or what I take for granted at times when I'm in the US. So here's Jay and I as I prepare to leave Thailand. Yeah, so this experience has been great and helped pave for the discussions and conversations for future work. So yeah, it's like I said, I have a lot of information to go through with this research and fellowship, but yet just a little sneak peek of what I was doing in my time in Thailand. I think the great thing about this is that the art forms and the greatness of art as a form of documentation and being able to look at these objects and begin to learn about the people and their history and their culture through these objects. So yeah, Ochao, thank you.